Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac Address. My name's Sabra Lane. I'm the president of the club. I'm also the presenter of the ABC's Radio Current Affairs program, AM. Today's guest is the Energy and Environment Minister, Josh Frydenberg. He has probably one of the most difficult jobs in Australia right now, trying to get a national agreement on how to cut emissions in the electricity sector, all the while keeping our Paris commitments and keeping the backbench happy. He's sitting down with the nation's energy ministers next week to try and do that, and all the while he is getting free tips from the sidelines. If you're following the conversation online, please use the hashtag NPC, and our Twitter user handle is @PressClubAUST. Please welcome Josh Frydenberg.
Well, thanks, Sabra. A day doesn't go past without a story in the newspapers about energy bills, and it gets raised with me in all sorts of places. The football, a family barbecue, and even my local place of worship, not Parliament House, but the local synagogue, where an elderly man came up to me recently and said, "Joshua, what can you do to reduce my power bill?" And I say to him that we are reducing your power bill, and we do understand how important it is to you. Today I want to make 3 points. First, to reflect on the enormous change underway in the energy system, which has turned accepted wisdoms on their head, disrupted traditional business models, and exposed a failure of policy which is reflected in poor market outcomes. Second, to provide a frank assessment of the polarised political debate on energy and climate and the high price we are paying for it. It's time to tell some home truths. This is a practical problem, not one which extreme ideologies can solve. We need to find sensible, workable, market-based solutions that meet the requirements of the Australian people. The alternative is policy paralysis, more expensive short-term government interventions and higher prices that will be paid by the public either as a consumer or as a taxpayer. Third, I want to make the case for the National Energy Guarantee as the most practical means of delivering a more affordable and reliable energy system while meeting our international commitments. The guarantee has the fundamental virtue of using the effectiveness of the market and freeing up the policy debate. It addresses the policy and market failure and cuts through the polarisation to integrate energy and climate policy. In the year 2000, the national electricity market had just 3 wind farms and 2 tiny solar farms, generating less than 0.1% of supply, and more than 90% of power came from fossil fuels. Less than 1% of households had solar panels, with the rest drawing their energy from the centralised grid and its large spinning turbines. Smart meters, peer-to-peer trading and home batteries were still a fledgling idea. Today, the shape of the market could not be more different. Over the last 5 years, more than 90% of new generation has been wind and solar. Over the last 10 years, a third of our coal-fired power stations have closed, and gas prices on the East Coast have nearly tripled as parity pricing with international markets take hold. Consumers who once sat passively at the end of the supply chain, receiving a homogeneous product from state-owned utilities, are now empowered through technology to choose how and when power is generated, stored and used. In fact, with nearly 20% of homes now having solar panels, the highest on a per capita basis anywhere in the world, the generating capacity sitting on top of Australian rooftops is twice that of Australia's biggest power plant. The issue of emissions reduction has moved from the pages of scientific journals to the agenda papers of boardrooms. Treaties have been signed, commitments have been made, and governments around the world are taking action. And with firms responsible for more than $80 trillion of assets supporting climate-related financial disclosure, a new variable has been added to the commercial equation. No longer do energy companies and their financiers simply invest based on the dynamics of supply and demand and the basic rate of return on their capital. Questions of climate are now a consideration. When the national electricity market was simply concerned with the delivery of energy, which predominantly came from coal and gas, the established market signals worked and low wholesale prices followed. But now the requirement of emissions reduction has been added to the mix and the penetration of renewables has increased. The national electricity market is no longer delivering the consistently low wholesale prices and the effective signal for new investment, which were its hallmarks. And it is within this new paradigm that policy must be reframed. While change will always create political debate, after more than a decade of national conversation on energy and climate, we unfortunately have more conflict than consensus. Unresolved, this is harming all Australians, and we must come to a landing and a practical solution. As John Howard said in a headland speech before winning government, the Liberal tradition has always held that our ideas are not political ends in themselves, but the basis for developing practical policies that work for the common good. Ladies and gentlemen, energy is no different. But sadly, positions today are being based on ideology, not engineering. Ideas are being judged on their provenance, not on their merits. Energy policy in Australia is no longer simply an economic issue, it has become a cultural one. And as politicians set their battle lines, consumers are the casualties. This is the hard truth. The future of energy policy must be determined by the proper consideration of the public's interest, not ideologically driven predisposition. The answer lies neither in a war on coal nor the nationalisation of our energy assets. You can excuse the public's confusion when they hear both ends of the political spectrum sing from the same hymn sheet, calling for government intervention in the energy market, but to achieve diametrically opposite outcomes. To end this polarisation of views, proliferation of policies and uncertainty in the market, it is high time for a balanced, enduring, market-based and broadly accepted course of action. But rational policy must start with rational debate. And so to cut through the myths, we do need to tell some home truths. Fossil fuels have been the bedrock of Australia's energy system, a ticket to our prosperity. Those who would close coal with haste, as Labor and the Greens are on the record for, would see power bills up and our lights go out. For this reason, you will not hear the coalition demonise coal. The closures of the Northern and Hazelwood coal stations in South Australia and Victoria are illustrative. After their closure, the spot price increased by more than 80% within a year, with a consequential knock-on effect well beyond each state's borders. In fact, across the summer just gone, coal and gas produced 82% of the NEM's power. At 7:30 p.m. on the 18th of January, when South Australia's demand peaked and they most needed power, their wind farms operated at less than 10% of their capacity. South Australia's lights were kept on thanks to gas and mainly brown coal over the interconnector with Victoria. Indeed, last year, 17 of the top 20 generators by output were coal-fired. And while fossil fuels will be critical long into the future, we should recognise that our national fleet of 20 coal-fired power stations have an average age of 27 years. While they may not live forever, there is still plenty of life left in them. And for that reason, the market has signalled it is more willing to upgrade existing plants where the upfront capital investment has already been made than to build new ones. This is because constructing a new coal-fired power station would take more than 5 years and have an uncertain utilisation rate and return on capital. The importance of gas as a transition fuel must also not be forgotten. As the energy mix changes and more gas peakers are required to smooth out renewables, gas is increasingly setting the price of electricity. In 2014, it set the price 13% of the time, compared to over 20% today. But with higher gas demand comes higher electricity prices, which are 40% more when gas is setting the price compared to coal. The answer is more gas. And Victoria, the Northern Territory and New South Wales have a responsibility to do more to develop their resources, not simply import it from elsewhere. With Victoria's Gippsland Basin in significant decline, AEMO is predicting a gas shortfall in Victoria in 2022. The question for Australia's most gas-dependent state is why would you force households and businesses to pay up to 30% more to import gas from interstate or overseas when there is 40 years' worth of supply under the ground? The current impasse when it comes to gas development is an illustration of the Pyrrhic victory of ideology over science and economics. A second home truth is that renewables have developed faster and further than originally thought. But these technologies, pulled through with taxpayer support, can now stand on their own. The cost of wind and solar has halved in the last 5 years. The head of the International Energy Agency, Dr. Fatih Birol, said to me on his recent visit to Australia that what is driving the rapid uptake of renewables is not so much emission reduction, but the declining cost curve. It has always struck me as paradoxical that the first to say renewables are cost competitive are often the loudest to call for another round of subsidies. But as we make clear in the National Energy Guarantee, the time for new subsidies is over. For those who suggest the government is anti-renewables for calling out this economic reality, the evidence to the contrary is an inconvenient truth. Last year, under the Turnbull government, was Australia's biggest year ever, for large and small-scale renewables, and more than $12 billion and 7,000 megawatts of investment is now underway. The increased supply has seen the forward curve for renewable certificates at $34 in 2020 compared to $80 today. According to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, in 2017, Australia was the world's 7th largest clean energy investor, and on a per capita basis, the 3rd highest of the top 20 investors. Twice the investment per capita of Germany, 4 times China, and 5 times that of France. While this wave of investment supported by the renewable energy target will lower wholesale prices, it is only one side of the story. This investment has come with a consequence and a cost. The consequence is that, as we've seen with South Australia, the intermittency of wind and solar has created real challenges in the reliability of supply. And the cost is that, according to the Australian Energy Market Commission, the combination of the large-scale renewable energy target and the small-scale renewable energy scheme adds around $60 to the annual average household electricity bill. These are the basic truths that make it clear that government should be providing no new subsidies, be they to renewables or coal. Let them battle it out in a properly regulated, technology-neutral market. A third home truth is that whether people like it or not, we are moving towards a carbon-constrained future. This reality is shaping our energy system and is part of the decision-making matrix for generators, networks, retailers, and consumers. While the weight of global politics, technology and capital markets are all pointing in one direction, it has led former US Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz to say, "You can't stop the waves crashing on the beach." This means dealing with climate change responsibly. Australia beat its first Kyoto target, and since coming to government, we have repealed Labor's damaging carbon tax as its first order of business and put Australia on track to easily overachieve its 2020 target. We did this without risking the economy. Since coming to office in 2013, GDP is up more than $200 billion, our population is around 1.5 million larger, and nearly 1 million jobs have been created. The government is proud of this record and confident of meeting the challenge of 2030. But with just 1.3% of the world's emissions, we must recognise that Australia can't solve climate change alone. Calls to decarbonise the economy overnight are as irresponsible as they are futile. Only international action can make a difference. And that is why we join 175 nations in ratifying the Paris Agreement. But what we will not do is engage in virtue signalling and gesture politics at the expense of our blue-collar workers and their industries and our international competitiveness. At a time when power bills are straining household budgets, particularly for low-income earners, it's not a time for ideological big experiments and recklessly high emission reduction targets. Since the Prime Minister put energy policy on top of the agenda at this very lectern last year, the Turnbull government is effectively tackling all parts of the energy power bill through our plan. The wholesale price of electricity traded on the ASX futures has fallen around 20% since its peaks last year. I would expect retailers to pass on every dollar of those lower costs to consumers. And customers are entitled to insist on this. Our intervention in the gas market has secured more gas for Australians that was otherwise destined for overseas, ensured 3 mothballed gas generators came back online and led to contract prices falling, according to the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, by up to 50% from their highs last year. We have taken on networks by abolishing the limited merits review. The inaction by the previous federal Labor government on this issue did cost consumers up to $6.5 billion. And since meeting with the Prime Minister last year, retailers have simplified their offerings and written to around 1.6 million households to tell them that better deals are available. Nearly 1 million people have visited the government's website to compare their offers, and it is something that everybody should do. Our investments in Snowy 2.0 and other pumped hydro projects and utility-scale batteries are laying the foundation for the power system of the future. Energy storage is critical because the stability of our grid cannot be left to the whim of the weather. While there is more to do, these actions are bearing fruit. But, ladies and gentlemen, the hardest nut to crack is properly integrating energy and climate change policy. But crack it we must, because as in the words of the Energy Security Board, and I quote, 15 years of climate policy instability has complicated long-term investment decisions and left our energy system vulnerable to escalating prices while being both less reliable and secure. As Chief Scientist Alan Finkel, who joins us today, simply put it, business as usual is not an option. As a Liberal, I consider that the answer lies in a strong private sector and a well-functioning market. While improvements are needed, to paraphrase Mark Twain, reports the demise of the national electricity market have been greatly exaggerated. The NEM, which is the world's longest interconnected system, emerged from Australia's golden era of competition reforms and has served Australia well. But if we expect the private sector to invest the $200 billion of energy infrastructure Australia needs out to 2050, then it does need to know the rules of the game. And with the average power station lasting more than 10 elections, Hazelwood itself saw 14 Prime Ministers in its lifetime. Investors need confidence that the goalposts won't be continually moved. So unless people are proposing that the government renationalise the system and foot the $200 billion bill, the real question is this: how do we establish a policy framework that manages the transition, that achieves the objectives of lower prices, higher reliability and lower emissions, and provides constancy and consistency through different political cycles? This cannot be achieved through the lens of ideology, but rather through markets working effectively. The National Energy Guarantee is our first and best opportunity for Australia to do this. Recommended by the Independent Energy Security Board, it has galvanised unprecedented support from energy users and producers alike. According to independent modelling, wholesale prices will fall on average by 23% over the decade 2020 to 2030. Households will be $300 a year better off compared to Labor's policy. A vote against the guarantee is a vote for higher prices, higher emissions and less reliability. Let's be clear what the NEG is and what the NEG isn't. It is a mechanism which uses the existing electricity market, both spot and contract, where already energy is being traded between buyers and sellers. It places an obligation on retailers to provide sufficient dispatchability to ensure reliability. This is power on demand, irrespective of the weather, while also requiring retailers to reduce the emissions intensity of their portfolio over time. This is fundamental to restoring faith in the national electricity market by driving long-term investment in the right technologies at the right place at the right time, an outcome that to date has escaped policymakers both here and abroad. It is not a new tax, a new subsidy, or an emissions trading scheme. It does not collect revenue for government. It is technology neutral, and it does not pick winners. It is not pro-coal or anti-coal, pro-renewables or anti-renewables. All technologies will compete on their merits. It simply provides, according to the Energy Security Board, a clear investment signal so the cleanest, cheapest and most reliable generation gets built. The guarantee also provides an inbuilt check and balance. If a state has a separate scheme to incentivise intermittent renewables, the reliability component will ensure that stability is not compromised. While it is my well-known view that it would be preferable not to have a proliferation of state schemes, I recognise that states and territories may pursue them regardless. The guarantee, therefore, will not preclude state renewable schemes, but rather include their contribution to reducing emissions within the overall target. This approach preserves the Commonwealth's responsibility as the signatory to the Paris Agreement to set the emissions target at a pro rata contribution from the electricity sector of 26%. A criticism that I've heard is that the guarantee might limit growth in renewables. Nothing could be further from the truth. The modelling of the Energy Security Board shows that renewables under the guarantee will nearly double from 17% today to between 32 and 36% by 2030. The Commonwealth, the states and the Energy Security Board are also focused on the issue of market concentration. Since 2009, the share of capacity held by AGL, Origin and Energy Australia has gone from 15 to 48%. Across the national electricity market jurisdictions, the top three players have on average 70% of the retail market share. The risk to consumer outcome is why we've tasked the ACCC to examine the competitiveness of retail electricity supply. Market concentration is a problem, but just as it wasn't created by the guarantee, it can't in itself be fixed by the guarantee. We are of course vigilant to ensure the guarantee does not make the situation worse, and are thinking about how do we do best to ensure a deep, liquid and transparent contract market. It is worth noting that retailers across the spectrum support the guarantee, including medium-sized players like PowerShop, who see opportunities to expand their market share through innovation. In conclusion, let me end where I began, with the concerns of my elderly friend. The answer is yes, we can do something about your power bill, and we are. The Turnbull government is putting in place a comprehensive plan which at its very heart has the National Energy Guarantee. The framework is practical and market-based and will get the national electricity market working again in the interests of consumers. At next week's COAG Energy Council meeting, the Energy Security Board will present a high-level model developed in close consultation with stakeholders and will seek the Council's agreement to move to the next phase of detailed design. The goal is for ministers to agree the final guarantee design in August, with legislation passed before the end of the year. Federal legislation to set the emissions target, state legislation to enact the mechanism. To make the National Energy Guarantee a reality, all national electricity market jurisdictions, Coalition and Labor, will need to agree. And so governments at all levels and parties of all political persuasions must put their ideology aside and work together to put the national interest first. The National Energy Guarantee is our best chance to secure a lasting consensus. We must not miss this opportunity to deliver for Australia a more affordable, reliable energy system and a lower emissions future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. We'll get to questions from the floor in a tick. I'm just interested to pick up on a practical point that you talked about in your speech about the price of electricity having dropped 20% since the peak last year that they were traded on the stock exchange. You've said that customers should see the benefit of that now. How should they go about making sure that they're getting the benefit now? And should they see a 20% drop in their power bills? Like, what are you suggesting?
So the 20% or more drop, depending on which particular jurisdiction, relates to the wholesale component of the power bill. The wholesale component is about a third. We've already seen PowerShop and Alinta this year reduce power prices. July is the next period in which energy companies will adjust their prices. I've made it very clear to the CEOs that with that decline in the forward curve for wholesale prices and what we've seen in the gas market as well, we would expect that to be passed on to consumers. Now, it's not, I don't know what the number's going to be. I'm sure they don't know what the number's going to be. There are a lot of factors at play. But certainly, we are expecting to see power prices come down, and the work that is done in the wholesale component sits neatly with the work that is being done to reduce network prices, to get consumers a better deal from their retailers by, at the first stage, informing them of the comparable offers in the market, as well as, importantly, getting more gas into the system, because gas is increasingly setting the price of electricity.
Phil Curry.
Hi, Minister. I'm Phil Curry from the Fin Review. Labor's one of its chief criticisms of the NEG is they don't think their emissions reduction trajectory is robust enough. You're talking 26 to 28. They talk about 45. If a future Labor government, if Labor were to support this and then get into power one day and legislate a stronger target, A, would the design of the NEG enable that, or B, would it disrupt the whole mechanism and cause investor certainty? Can it be tweaked by future governments?
Well, obviously, the emissions reduction target will be built in legislation, so they would have to pass legislation. But what the National Energy Guarantee does, Phil, is it puts a reliability requirement for the first time. So if there were more renewables to come into the system because of a change to the legislated target, then there would be that additional requirement that would now be in the market. And it reflects one of the problems that we've seen in South Australia with a very high penetration of wind and solar and the closure of the Northern Power Station, but not enough backup, and that's why they've had to rush in diesel generators in that state. That's why we're investing in battery and ultimately a pumped hydro facility in the Upper Spencer Gulf, because too much wind and solar without the necessary backup and storage leads to volatility and ultimately higher prices. So it is possible for that future government to change the legislation, but at the same time there is that restriction on new intermittent sources coming into the market, namely that it would have to meet the reliability requirement, which I point out, Phil, will be set by AEMO on a regional basis. And that's really important because in a state like Queensland, they have a very high predominance of coal, as well as in New South Wales. Their vulnerabilities to more intermittency is not as great as, for example, South Australia's is.
Karen Sweeney.
Hi, Karen Sweeney from AAP. AEMO's letter to you in March this year says, quote, if the National Energy Guarantee is not agreed to by December 2018, AEMO recommends that an alternative process to acquire the 850 megawatts of Liddell be pursued. By pressuring AGL now to sell Liddell to Alinta, is that a sign that you and the government aren't confident that the NEG can be agreed by the end of the year? And if you are confident, then why is there this sense of urgency?
2 points. The first is that the National Energy Guarantee can solve for reliability in the system by requiring greater dispatchable power, whether it's through a reverse auction, whether it's through other means. But the surest way to ensure that we don't have that 850 megawatt shortfall, which was identified by AEMO, is to keep Liddell going beyond its scheduled end of life in 2022. We also have comments from the ACCC, from Rod Sims, who's made it very clear that were Liddell to be sold to another party, it would introduce more competition and lower prices. So you've got to deal with both the reliability issue as well as the pricing issue. And my message to AGL is if you don't want to run it beyond 2022, and obviously we'd like you to run it beyond 2022, then sell it to an interested party that does. Now, they would obviously, in the case of Alinta, need to make a commercially acceptable offer. But they would be taking on the remediation costs, they'd be taking on the requirements to build, to upgrade the plant, to ensure its continued life. But it's just not acceptable to a government to have advice that said there'll be a greater likelihood of blackouts in New South Wales were this power station to close. And let's not forget, it was Andy Vesey himself who first raised with the Prime Minister, and I was present at that meeting, the idea of selling Liddell. And so from the government's perspective, we would like to see it continue, whether it's being run by AGL or whether it's run by Alinta or another party. We do have a period between the closure of Liddell, which is scheduled for 2022, and the opening of Snowy 2.0, which is scheduled for 2024, that there will be a need for continuous backup support and dispatchable power, and obviously that's where the continuation of Liddell will be important.
Sheridan Holderhead.
Sheridan from the Adelaide Advertiser. I just wondered, the new South Australian Liberal government has pledged to ban fracking in the state's southeast. It's a decisive departure from the former Labor government's policy, which was essentially drill baby drill. Given you have spoken today about the importance of gas for the future energy security and called other states out for their bans, are you disappointed that your South Australian Liberal colleagues have drawn battle lines that give into the anti-frackers rather than basing their policy on science? And will their decision affect the state's GST share?
Well, it's certainly not for me to... I've got enough hot water baths to navigate rather than getting into the quagmire of the GST. Look, I'm on the record of saying it's my preference that all governments adopt an evidence scientific-based approach to both unconventional and conventional gas extraction, regardless of their political hue, Liberal, National, Labor. In the case of South Australia, Stephen Marshall does allow unconventional gas extraction in both the Cooper and the Eromanga basins. He has been upfront in the lead up to the last election about this particular restriction. The Chief Scientist in the Finkel Review made it very clear as one of his recommendations that you can have an evidence-based approach to unconventional gas extraction which uses the right techniques, the right data, transparency, that you can do that in a way that is both environmentally responsible and economically attractive. That's where we're trying to get. In Victoria, not only do they have a restriction on unconventional onshore gas extraction, but unbelievably a restriction on onshore conventional gas extraction. And it's a real problem in Victoria because they're more gas dependent than any other state, with households and businesses using a great deal of gas. They've got declining supply coming out of the Gippsland Basin. AEMO have highlighted that, and the ACCC have said that to transport gas could be $2 to $4 a gigajoule from the north of our country down to its south. Now, in New South Wales, a Liberal government is obviously considering what to do about the Narrabri resource. We would encourage every government to approach this in a scientific and evidence-based way, including the Northern Territory government, which is sitting on potentially 200 years of gas supply, which would be of enormous benefit, and anticipating that this could be opened up. We've had a feasibility study look into extending the pipeline from the north of our country through to Moomba and then obviously to make its way to markets on the east coast. Importing gas through LNG terminals, right, ultimately shows, in Victoria, where they're talking about that, and New South Wales, ultimately shows that that is a second best option behind developing the gas at its source and not having to fork out extra money for the transportation.
Ben Packham.
Minister. Ben Packham from The Australian. You've said that electric cars are the next iPhone, that there'll be 1 million of them on the road in Australia by 2030. Electric car drivers already enjoy significant subsidies. They get a break on the fuel tax. There's a tax break on the luxury car tax. And there's also predictions the grid will have to be significantly upgraded to cope with electric cars with bigger batteries and faster chargers. How will the government avoid a repeat of what we saw with the rooftop solar situation, where you had wealthy people being able to access and enjoy new technology paid for by everybody else?
Well, we're not proposing new subsidies in terms of electric vehicles. There are great benefits from the rollout of electric vehicles, but at the same time there are costs. The fact that 13 out of the 16 electric vehicles on sale in Australia today are over $60,000 indicates that there is still that restriction. The other thing that people are concerned about is the length of distance that they can travel on a battery charge, although the chief scientist tells me, well, it might be 350 kilometres today, it won't be long before it's 1,000 kilometres. That will make a significant difference. The other thing that here in Australia, we only have about 470 odd recharging stations, whereas if you go to Europe, they've got more than 60,000 recharging stations. So it's one of the issues that I'll be discussing with my energy ministerial counterparts. How do we coordinate better? Because the other key factor, and you referred to this, Ben, there will be an extra demand on the grid from electric vehicles. AEMO has said that it will be about an extra 2% of demand, and so therefore we can cope with it. But what you want to do is incentivise electric vehicle drivers to come home, and rather than recharge their car battery at 5 or 6 o'clock and then put demand on the grid when everyone else is cooking their meal or putting the air conditioner on or got the pool pump operating, you want them to plug it in and then to recharge at midnight when power is cheap, and that you won't need to build out the capacity of the network, which is obviously an expensive infrastructure cost. So there are a lot of smart things we can do to deal with the inevitable rollout of electric vehicles. We do have a lower threshold for the luxury car tax. You referred to the fuel excise issue. Obviously the CFC and ARENA are also both supporting the rollout of electric vehicles, but we have no plans for new subsidies.
Jennifer Bekwati.
Minister, Jennifer Beshwadi from Sky News. I just wanted to know, AGL gave 7 years' notice to close Liddell. Is that not enough? And if it's not, what is? Are you saying that private companies shouldn't sell old coal-fired power stations? And just to elaborate on the response to Karen, AGL's boss today has given alternative plans for the Liddell plant, including possibly refurbishing for gas fire, wind, solar, even batteries. Will you now endorse that and stop putting pressure on the company to sell it?
The government is in possession of a report from the Australian Energy Market Operator, which makes for pretty grim reading. It says that there is going to be an 850 megawatt shortfall in dispatchable power were Liddell to close, and you don't get the added investment in the market. Now, you referred to the three-stage plan that AGL has put forward as a replacement, and it does include renewables, it does include batteries, it does include gas peakers. But AGL has not financially committed to those three stages. So you're asking the government to wait for a board decision down the track, dependent on whatever the gas price may be, whoever's chairman or CEO, whatever else is happening in the market at the time. You're asking us to wait for that before we actually secure supply. That is not something that the government will do. And that is why AEMO themselves have said that if the National Energy Guarantee is not agreed and Liddell is not sold to another party or does not continue beyond 2022, then it will have to look at other alternatives. Now, those other alternatives will ultimately mean more costs to consumers, and that is not a good outcome. So the issue at play is not whether AGL, with the greatest respect, have given sufficient notice. The issue at play is the state of the market today, based on the advice of AEMO and the ACCC, and what is in the public interest. And the public interest, as far as the Turnbull government is concerned, is reliability of supply and lower prices. And that is not enhanced by the closure of Liddell in 2022.
I'm just interested to pick up on a point. AGL has long put out their plans for this, and you've said that the company should speak with Alinta about its bid. Why is Alinta getting such a favourable leg up by the government, given that it closed the Northern Power Plant in South Australia with 12 months' notice, and it caused a lot of the problems that that state has dealt with?
Well, to correct you, Sabra, Alinta is not getting a cent from the government. What the government is saying is that if Alinta, with the backing of some of Australia's biggest employers through Manufacturing Australia, want to bid for the Liddell Power Station, then AGL should properly consider that, because we believe it's in the public interest to continue. Now, Alinta did own the Northern Power Station, and one of the problems that they had was that they couldn't get the long offtake agreements from the large industrial users to maintain that plant in the face of a lot more renewables coming in, because when renewables come in, they can dispatch at zero marginal cost, and therefore it's going to hurt the business model of the coal-fired power stations unless they have embedded offtake agreements. Unfortunately for those manufacturers, they left themselves open to the spot market. They paid a high price when, as I said, the spot market price went up by over 80%. They don't want to see a repeat of that. That is why the manufacturers, in the meeting with me a couple of weeks back, said we are interested in keeping Liddell open, and that's why I put Manufacturers Australia in touch with Alinta, because I knew that Alinta, having just bought Loy Yang B Power Station Victoria, was interested in extending its market presence. It's already the 5th largest integrated energy company. They have not sought any Commonwealth financial support, and we have made no offer of it.
Anthony Galloway.
Anthony Galloway from the Career Mail. You spoke about extreme ideologies. I was just wondering, are you referring both to people on the left who are cheering on renewables without regard to dispatchable power, as well as some of your own coalition colleagues who are talking about renationalising coal plants?
Well, certainly it's a message to people who are saying, let's decarbonise the economy virtually overnight, without seeing an important ongoing role for fossil fuels and backup and storage. And it was also a message to those who are saying, let's nationalise our energy assets. I don't support, the Prime Minister doesn't support, a compulsory acquisition of Liddell. Snowy 2.0 was a different situation. It's been in the possession of the government since the days of Chifley and Menzies. That is why the government obviously owns Snowy 2.0 and is investing in it. But the situation we have at the present in the market is that it's not delivering for consumers because we don't have the right investment signals. And the National Energy Guarantee will, for the first time, create the right investment signals so that the market can make that $200 billion worth of investment that is needed. If it's not the market, the only other place it comes from is government, and government can't foot such a huge bill.
Nick Stewart.
Nick Stewart, Canberra Times. Thank you very much. Sorry, I forgot my lump of coal that I normally carry around with me. You've talked about Snowy 2.0. There have been increasing suggestions that actually that's not going to, whilst it will be incredibly environmentally sound, it won't be as economically viable as various other ways. What of generating electricity? What guarantees can you give us that we won't see a political that the way in which you've been talking, that it won't become a political fix that you are fixated on, rather than, and that you will in fact go for genuine market-based solution with regard to Snowy 2.0 as well?
Well, more than 97% of storage for renewables around the world is in pumped hydro, and Australia only has three facilities, including Snowy and Tumut and the Wivenhoe Dam, and the other is the Shoalhaven scheme. We need to invest in pumped hydro if we are going to smooth out the volatility in the market which comes with more renewables. Now, Snowy 2.0 is an additional 2,000 megawatts of storage. It's enough to power 500,000 homes. It has an independent board which will make a decision on a final investment decision by the end of the year. They can fund it off their own balance sheet. They've provided some $2 billion worth of dividends to governments over the last decade, so it's a profitable company. And we believe that that level of storage is what is going to be required in the market. Let's not forget, Snowy has a pretty unique topography. There is no other places around the country which has the existing dam infrastructure and pipeline infrastructure and the capacity to build such a facility. So it's the right investment at the right time to set up our market for another 60 years. Now, you referred at the start of your question to whether it's the most cost-effective way to do so. One of the real challenges we have in the market is, gas peakers are expensive. This is going to be much cheaper than gas peakers. It's going to be much cheaper than spending over $100 billion on Tesla Powerwall batteries, to make up the backup. This is a cost-effective, large-scale investment that I think will set Australia up for decades to come.
David Denham.
David Denham from Preview Magazine, Minister. I'd like to explore a little what your thoughts are about emission reduction, because and where it's going to be in the next few years, because since 2013 we've been increasing it almost linearly for the whole year. We still give subsidies to coal miners with the diesel rebate, and the population is still growing leaps and bounds compared with all our OECD countries, and our per capita emissions are still large. So could you articulate where you think, which sectors, where can you see there'll be gains in reducing the emissions?
Well, the reality is you have to take an all-of-the-above approach to achieving that 26 to 28% target. It's first important to recognise that emissions in Australia on a per capita and GDP basis are their lowest in 28 years. They're lowest in 28 years. And we are scheduled to overachieve on our 2020 target by 294 million tonnes. Now, when Labor was in office, they were going to underachieve on their 2020 target by over 700 million tonnes. 1 million tonnes is the equivalent of taking 300,000 cars off the road for a year. So this is a significant improvement in our position. When it comes to our 2030 target, there's still a long way to go, but we've improved our abatement task by 60% over the last 2 years alone. In the last couple of quarters, the electricity sector has come down quite significantly as more renewables have taken hold. The electricity sector is 1/3 of the carbon footprint across the economy. The other sectors which are important are the land sector and we have the Emissions Reduction Fund, which has been able to reduce emissions by about 190 million tonnes at an average cost of about $12 a tonne, which is cost effective. Paul Fletcher and I are working on an emission reduction strategy for the transport sector, which is important. We have efficiency standards that we're rolling out both for the built environment as well as appliances, because that's really important. And at the same time, there are some things you can't stop. For example, our cattle herd and our sheep flock have extended extensively, and you can't stop them belching and whatever else, because they produce CO2 emissions. The other challenge we've had is our large LNG export industry is very emissions intensive as you liquefy natural gas. So we are dealing with the swings and roundabouts of emissions reduction, but what we will not do is reduce emissions at the cost of jobs and at the cost of people's power bills. You need a stable, sensible policy. I think we can achieve all three outcomes: affordability, reliability and emissions reduction, but you do that in a considered way, not in a way that is reckless.
Chris Ullman.
Hi Minister, Chris Ullman, 9 News. What's missing from the debate today is the actual detail of the National Energy Guarantee, and Shane Rattenbury, who you've invited here today, can't really make a decision on it until he sees that detail. So when will we see it? Will it be next week, and will you take it back before your party room?
Two things. Well, firstly, it's the Energy Security Board, Chris, which will be presenting the detail of the National Energy Guarantee. It is the idea of the Energy Security Board. We have embraced it, and they will be providing a high-level design, including a discussion paper, which I understand, I have not seen it, but will be provided to all ministers relatively soon ahead of the meeting. In terms of my party room, there will be federal legislation that's required, and of course I will take that back to my party room. But let's not forget why we're here. We're here because the market is not delivering for consumers. The market signals are not there to get the right investment at the right place at the right time. We have failed in over a decade in Australia to properly integrate energy and climate policy. The National Energy Guarantee is the recommendation of the foremost experts in Australia's energy sector, and they say move forward with it, do it in a way that builds reliability, builds affordability into the system, and of course meets our international targets. So I think this is a critical meeting, and I would call upon my ministerial counterparts to obviously support the National Energy Guarantee and to hopefully tick off the final design mid-year.
Minister, we're close to time. Are you happy to take more questions just to go beyond?
Of course.
Lovely, thank you.
With more water. Yeah.
Excellent. Mark Kenny.
Thank you, Minister. Mark Kenny from Fairfax Media. Going back to Phil Curry's question about whether the NEG, the National Energy Guarantee mechanism, can be tweaked by a future government, can you tell us, I want to sort of explore that a bit further, can you tell us, could it be tweaked to take account of technological change? For example, if renewables in the future, or if certain renewable technologies become what you might call dispatchable now, that is, meet the definition of dispatchable energy now, will they be able to be counted on that side of the ledger? Whether that's through the advance of battery technologies or perhaps technologies we've yet to imagine, but we are talking about a mechanism that is meant to extend off into the future. So, can the mechanism cope with those sorts of technological changes? And very quickly, just on Alinta before, you said, I think in response to Sabra's question, that the company sought no subsidies and you've offered none. Can you here and now categorically rule out that there will be no cash or in-kind contribution from the government in relation to Liddell and Alinta or Delta?
This is a commercial discussion, Mark, between the two parties. We're not providing any financial support, and as I said, they've not sought it and we're not offering it. In terms of your first question, that would be a decision for AEMO as to what they would understand and categorise as dispatchable power, because this is a technical decision by the energy market operator to ensure reliability of supply, regardless of whether it's windy or it's sunny on a particular day. Now, dispatchable power can take the form of batteries, it can take the form of pumped hydro, it can take the form of coal, gas or even biomass or hydropower. So it's not a simple definition of a particular generation type that equals dispatchable power. That would be a matter for AEMO. But to your point, the technology change in renewables is very significant. We've recently invested, for example, in an ARENA project which is seeking to develop what are called FCAS, frequency control and ancillary services, which are needed to secure the system as opposed to stabilise the system, which is now being generated by wind farms. And we've done that project down in Tasmania. It's things like that which are never been thought of before, which new technologies are opening up. And I have no hesitation that the Energy Minister standing here today, standing here in 10 years' time, will be dealing with a very different market than I am dealing with today.
Tim Shaw.
Minister, Tim Shaw, Radio 2CC Canberra, ACT 100% renewable energy target. You mentioned in your speech about not precluding state or territory schemes. Can I just tease more of that out of you about what you mean by that? And certainly following on from Chris Uhlmann about, say, the impact in the ACT with a policy of 100% renewable energy targets.
Well, what it means is that if a state has a target to reduce its emissions by increasing renewables into their system, then that will count to the overall goal of a 26% reduction in the electricity sector across the national electricity market by 2030. Now, in Queensland, in Victoria, in New South Wales and others, they've got initiatives to underwrite or to support the rollout of renewables. I can't stop that. They're decisions made by sovereign governments. But the message is very clear. International treaties are the prerogative of the federal government, and therefore we set the emissions reduction target for the country, and what we want to do is have a holistic approach, a national solution for what is a national problem. Now, Shane and I, who's here today, we have a good constructive dialogue and discussion, and I think we both recognise the importance of landing a policy that sets Australia up for the future. And ACT sits at the table and has a vote as the other states and territories do. But it's worth pointing out that when it comes to the ACT, they represent less than 2% of the retail customers across Australia and 0.03% of the generation in the national electricity market. The ACT gets, other than a few solar farms, it gets its power from South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales. So I can't see a situation where we get the agreement of the other jurisdictions, Labor and Coalition, for this historic national reform, and the ACT blocks that. Of course, we have a constructive discussion. The suggestions, their engagement with the ESB is critical in settling the final design. But I can't see a situation where the other states, representing the other 99.097% of supply, agree to the National Energy Guarantee and ACT holds out. That would not be good for the interests of Australia, and it certainly would not be well received by consumers of Australia.
Sarah Martin.
Sarah Martin from the West Australian, although I feel like I should pass the microphone to Shane for a little fireside chat for us all. Minister, I just wanted to clarify your response to Chris Uhlmann. Are you saying you will take those design principles to the COAG Energy Council before your party room has seen them and or signed off on them? And isn't that sort of politically risky given the energy culture wars that we're seeing at the moment? And just on that, your colleagues who are railing against Paris and saying pensioners before Paris presumably are doing so because they see a political advantage in that position. Do you think that going to the next election campaigning, excuse me, out of breath, for action on climate change is popular, or do you think there is political merit in what your colleagues are saying?
Well, of course, I value all the views of my colleagues, but let's make a couple of points clear. Firstly, Australia's commitment to Paris was signed up to when Tony Abbott was the Prime Minister. And we recognise the importance of reducing emissions within the broader context of the energy market. And hopefully what I highlighted today was that it is impacting upon the decision of generators, networks, retailers, consumers, financiers. Everyone is thinking about that issue of climate when they're working out what they invest in and where. And the issue of the National Energy Guarantee, I've taken it through the party room. It was obviously an extensive, more than 3-hour discussion where there was a lot of constructive dialogue. I've now got the support to take it to the state ministers. We've got a 2-stage process. The high-level design discussion on the 20th of this month, followed by a final design discussion in August, after which I will need to then take the legislation to enact the National Energy Guarantee through my party room. So there'll be ample opportunity for my colleagues to engage constructively on this issue, and of course the Cabinet as well. But let me make it very clear, my message today. My message today is that if you want to continue with the political battle lines, the consumer of Australia will be the casualty. Energy markets are transforming remarkably. And what we must do is ensure that the market works again, because the market couldn't cope with emissions reduction and this greater penetration of renewables as it was previously designed. And with 1/3 of our coal-fired power stations closing, we saw enormous pressure on the supply-demand balance, hence the challenges over this summer. And we've seen volatility, particularly around points of peak demand, and ultimately that's led to higher prices. So the only way to get lower prices and a more reliable system is to fix the market. And the best and only way to fix the market is the National Energy Guarantee. So if we miss this opportunity, all Australian energy consumers will be worse off.
A last question today. Catherine Murphy.
Hello, Minister. Catherine Murphy. Now, I understand why you may not like the fact that the ACT can scuttle this scheme, but at the end of the day, they can. So why don't we pick up one of the ACT's issues and see if there's any flexibility? Now, you referred to, in your answer to Phil's question, the regional means of settling the emissions reduction target. Now, as that applies to the ACT, because of the location of their wind farms, in essence, the National Energy Guarantee would make them pay an emissions penalty twice. So there's a simple technical fix that you could contemplate to ensure that that doesn't happen. So it's a long-winded preamble saying, are you prepared to pony up on individual technical issues that the jurisdictions raise with you, given you're not in a take it or leave it position? And I know this is breaching the rules, Sabra, but I'm the last, so I'll just do one because I can't resist it. Do you think John Monash would have been able to get the neg through the coalition party room?
I don't know which is a harder question. Look, on the first issue, the reliability and the emissions reduction are different challenges. So the reliability issue has to be dealt with on a regional basis because the states are different. When it comes to emissions reduction, we are a nation who is striving to reduce our carbon footprint over time consistent with an international treaty. So it needs to be done on a national basis. Now, consumers in the ACT will be better off, not worse off, better off as a result of the policy stability and certainty that will come with the National Energy Guarantee and the opportunity that it will lead to a 23% reduction in the wholesale price. Obviously, the final design will need to be settled by the Energy Security Board, and we will have constructive discussions. But my message to the ACT is this has got to be successful, because if it's not, we've missed a historic opportunity. On the issue of Sir John Monash, well, there's been plenty of friendly and unfriendly fire, and even Sir John Monash would struggle to get his head above that trench from time to time. Look, Sir John Monash is a hero of mine. He was undoubtedly Australia's greatest citizen soldier. I've strongly supported Tim Fisher's move to see him posthumously promoted from General to Field Marshal. He was the only General to be knighted on the battlefield in over 200 years when King George V went to Bertangles, France in 1918. So he's an amazing person, and obviously he was an engineer and an intellectual, and with great line of scientific inquiry. I think he would look at today's energy market, Catherine, and see the huge opportunities in the behind-the-meter technology, in the peer-to-peer lending, and the demand response in the storage technologies, as well, of course, with traditional fossil fuels and the improvements that we've seen there. Obviously, I've said publicly I'd prefer if my colleagues change the name. Ultimately, that will be a matter for them. But I don't begrudge them for feeling passionate about energy policy, as I do, but I implore every member of the Parliament, regardless of their political side, to think about the engineering and the economics of this discussion, not the ideology, to put the extremities of the debate to the side, to put the national interest first, and that means securing our long-term future with the National Energy Guarantee. Thank you very much.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Mr.